There was a painting hanging in a coffee shop window that stopped me cold on a Tuesday morning in October. I had never met the artist. I didn't even know his name yet. But something in that canvas looked exactly like the inside of my chest. Every color I had never said out loud, every feeling I had buried for years. I had to find him. If this story moves you, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story like this one. The painting was small, maybe 12 inches wide, 14 tall. It hung in the window of a coffee shop called Ember and Ash on Dekalb Avenue in Decatur, Georgia, just east of Atlanta, where I had lived for 3 years and never really felt at home. The frame was simple wood, unstained, and the image itself was abstract, layers of deep blue and warm amber pulling against each other, with a single thin line of white cutting through the center like a crack in something that was almost breaking open. I stood on the sidewalk in my coat with my travel mug going cold in my hand, and I stared at that painting for a full 2 minutes before I realized I was blocking foot traffic. My name is Arlo. I was 34 years old that October, and I was a civil engineering technician for a small infrastructure consulting firm that did bridge assessments and road condition surveys across the Southeast. My days were spreadsheets, site visits, and technical reports. My evenings were takeout containers and television I wasn't really watching. My life was functional, organized, and almost entirely gray, and I had told myself for a long time that this was fine. That gray was stable. That stable was enough. I went inside, ordered my coffee, sat by the window, and kept looking at that painting. There was a small handwritten card taped below the frame. It said, "Original work by Noel Ashby. For inquiries, ask at the counter." I didn't ask. Not that morning. I just sat there and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific, quiet ache of being seen by something that couldn't possibly know you. I should tell you about Marcus. No, wait, I can't use that name. His name was Dominic, my partner of 4 years. He was a dental equipment sales representative who traveled Monday through Thursday every single week. And we had settled into a life together that was more like 2 people sharing a building than 2 people sharing a life. We were kind to each other, we were careful. We had long since stopped asking each other hard questions because we had both quietly agreed, without ever saying so, that the answers might be inconvenient. I wasn't unhappy with Dominic so much as I had stopped being present with him, and I think he had done the same with me. That is a hard thing to admit. It's harder still to admit that I didn't fully understand it until I stood in front of someone else's painting and felt more known than I had in 4 years. I went back to Ember and Ash the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning, a Friday, I finally asked the woman at the counter. Her name tag said Bet, about the artist. She smiled like she'd been expecting the question. "Noel comes in most Saturdays," she said. "He switches out the paintings every few weeks." "You like that one?" "I can't stop thinking about it," I said. She handed me my coffee and tilted her head slightly. "Then you should tell him that." I almost didn't go back on Saturday. I told myself it was strange to seek out a stranger because of a painting. I told myself I was being dramatic. I made coffee at home and sat at my kitchen table and stared at the wall for 20 minutes before I put on my coat and walked the 6 blocks to Dekalb Avenue. When I arrived, a man was standing at the window, adjusting the small card beneath the painting. He was maybe 30, slightly shorter than me, with dark hair that curled at the back of his neck and paint-stained fingers. I noticed the fingers first, I don't know why. He wore a gray canvas jacket and a plaid scarf the color of old bricks. He turned when the door opened, and his eyes found me immediately, the way eyes do when they're used to studying things. "You're the one who's been staring at my painting every morning," he said. I stopped walking. "How would you know that?" He nodded toward Bet at the counter. "She told me, don't be embarrassed." She meant it as a compliment. His name was Noel Ashby. He was a muralist and studio painter who had recently relocated to Decatur from Birmingham, Alabama. He did commissioned murals for businesses and community spaces. I would learn later that he had painted an entire exterior wall for a community health clinic in Edgewood and a stairwell installation for a middle school in Stone Mountain. The coffee shop window was what he called a gift series. Small paintings he donated to local businesses in the neighborhoods he moved through, just to put something real into the world. "Why that image?" I asked him. We were sitting at the corner table by the window, and Bet had brought us both coffee without being asked, as if this meeting had been scheduled for weeks. The blue and the amber, the white line. Noel wrapped both hands around his mug. That particular painting is about the moment right before you admit something to yourself. The pressure of two things pulling apart, the crack that lets the light in. He paused. Why does it get you? I didn't have an answer that made sense. Or rather, I had an answer that made too much sense, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud to a stranger. I don't know yet, I said. He nodded like that was the most honest thing I could have said. We talked for nearly 2 hours that first Saturday. He told me about Birmingham, about growing up in a family that appreciated handwork but didn't understand art, about the way he had taught himself to paint in his 20s by studying muralists online and filling 3 sketchbooks a year. He was warm and direct and curious in equal measure. He asked me questions the way good listeners do, not to fill silence, but because he actually wanted the answer. I told him about my work, about the bridge assessments, about the strange piece of standing on infrastructure that held people up without anyone noticing it. He liked that. He said it sounded like his gift paintings, structural, quiet, doing something essential that most people walked right past. I walked home that afternoon through Oakhurst, past the Saturday market on 2nd Avenue, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was actually inside my own life, instead of watching it from a careful distance. That evening, Dominic called from a hotel in Chattanooga. We talked for 11 minutes about his sales numbers and whether we needed to replace the kitchen faucet. When I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand and felt the full weight of something I had been avoiding for a very long time. I didn't do anything about it that night. But I stopped pretending I didn't feel it. Over the following 3 weeks, I went back to Ember and Ash every Saturday morning. Noel was there each time, either working on his card display, sketching in a notebook, or talking with Bet. Each week, we stayed longer. Each week, the conversation went deeper. He told me about a former relationship that had ended 2 years before. A man named Perry who had been his closest companion for 6 years, who he spoke of with genuine fondness and without bitterness. The relationship had ended gently, he said, the way things sometimes do when two people grow into different shapes without meaning to. He said they still sent each other birthday messages and occasional photographs of interesting skies. I envied the cleanness of that, the way it had been handled with care. I had still not told Noel anything about Dominic, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I hadn't figured out what to say about something I hadn't yet resolved in my own heart. And then on the 4th Saturday, something shifted. We had stepped outside to walk down Dekalb Avenue because the coffee shop had filled up. And the air was cold and bright the way Georgia air gets in November when it finally remembers it's supposed to be autumn. Noel was telling me about a new commission he'd taken, a mural project for a community garden space in the Kirkwood neighborhood, and he was describing the image he'd been sketching, this long horizontal piece about roots and water and what connects things underground. And without thinking, I said, "That sounds like something I'd want to look at every single day." He stopped walking. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Careful, and something else underneath the careful. Arlo, he said, and my name in his voice sounded different than it did anywhere else. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Okay, I said. Is there someone in your life I should know about? The cold air sat between us. A car passed. 2 kids on bikes rode through the crosswalk ahead of us. I looked at him and I didn't look away. Yes, I said, and I need to take care of that before anything else. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, and we walked back toward the coffee shop without saying much more. And somehow that silence was the most honest conversation I'd had in years. I want to be clear about what happened next because I think it matters. I did not call Dominic from the sidewalk in a burst of romantic momentum. I did not make any declarations or promises to Noel. I went home, sat at the kitchen table, and spent 3 days thinking with more honesty and more clarity than I had applied to my own life in a very long time. What I understood after those 3 days was this. The painting had not made me fall out of love with Dominic. Noel had not made me fall out of love with Dominic. I had been falling out of a life I hadn't chosen consciously for a long time, and I had been letting inertia hold me in place because change is frightening, and because Dominic was a good person who deserved better than what I had been giving him. That was the hardest part. He deserved better. He deserved someone who was fully there. Dominic came home that Thursday evening. We had dinner pasta I'd made from scratch, which I almost never did. And after dinner, I told him I needed to talk, and to his credit, he didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had also been waiting for a conversation he hadn't known how to start. We talked for 3 hours, not angry, not cruel. Honest in a way we probably should have been a year earlier, maybe 2 years earlier. We had grown into different shapes, just like Noel had said about Perry, and I understood in that moment that there's no villain in that kind of story. There is only time and attention, and the choices people make or fail to make before things go too quiet. Dominic cried, I cried. We agreed on what needed to happen, and we agreed to handle it with respect. He moved in with his brother in Smyrna while we worked out the practical details. It took a month and a half of careful, difficult conversations, and I will not pretend it was easy or painless for either of us. But it was honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, is a form of respect. I did not contact Noel during that time. Not because I was hiding anything from him, but because it felt important to close one chapter before I could honestly open another. I needed the space to be sure that what I was doing was for the right reasons, that I was not leaving Dominic for Noel, but leaving a life that had stopped being true, and that Noel was a separate thing, a possibility, not a cause. There is a difference between those two things, and I think it matters enormously. It was the second week of December when I finally walked back into Ember and Ash on a Saturday morning. The painting in the window had changed. The blue and amber piece was gone. In its place was something new, a canvas in warm greens and deep umber, with two shapes that seemed to be reaching toward each other without quite touching. Bet told me later that Noel had donated the blue and amber piece to a community center in Panthersville. I was glad it had gone somewhere it would be seen. I ordered my coffee and sat at the corner table. Noel arrived 20 minutes later, and when he saw me, he stopped in the doorway for just a moment. Not a long moment, but long enough. He sat down across from me, and Bet brought him his usual without being asked, and he looked at me with those careful, studying eyes. "How are you?" he asked. "Better," I said. "Honest. It's been a hard few weeks, but I'm honest." He nodded. "I'm glad you're here." "I wanted to be sure I was here for the right reasons," I said. Before I came back, something in his expression settled, like he'd been holding a small tension and just released it. "I've been painting a lot," he said. "When I don't know what to do with something, I paint." "What did you paint?" He reached into the canvas bag he carried everywhere and slid a small photograph across the table. It was a picture of a painting, 12 by 14, simple wood frame. The image was all that deep blue again, but this time the white line wasn't a crack. It was wider, more intentional. More like a door than a break. "I didn't title it," he said. "But I kept it." I held the photograph and felt the same thing I had felt on that first Tuesday morning on the sidewalk, except this time I understood what I was feeling. It wasn't just being seen by something that couldn't know you. It was being seen by someone who had been paying attention from the very beginning, without any obligation to do so, simply because that was who he was. "Can I see it in person?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." We settled into something gradual and intentional after that. No rush, no urgency. We had both been through enough to understand that the best things are built slowly and honestly, and we were both people who knew the difference between momentum and meaning. His studio was a rented space on Commerce Drive in the Avondale Estates area, just a 10-minute drive from my apartment. The first time he invited me there, on a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, I stood in the doorway and just looked at the room. Canvases everywhere. Half-finished murals sketched in charcoal on large paper rolls pinned to the walls. Jars of brushes sorted by size, trays of paint in colors I didn't have names for. The smell of linseed oil and cold air from a drafty window, and in the corner on a shelf by itself was the painting with the white door. "That's the one," I said. "Yeah," he said from behind me. We spent that afternoon the way I would come to love spending Sunday afternoons. Him working, me sitting with a book I wasn't really reading, both of us talking in the easy, unhurried way that happens when you're not performing for each other. He played music from a small Bluetooth speaker, instrumental stuff mostly, and occasionally he would turn and ask me something, about my week, about a bridge I'd assessed in Covington, about what I'd been thinking about. No one had asked me what I'd been thinking about in a very long time. One afternoon he handed me a brush. "I don't paint," I said. "I know," he said. "That's not what this is about." He gestured to a small canvas with a bare background wash of pale yellow. "Just make a mark." "Anything?" I stood there for a moment, feeling the strange vulnerability of holding a brush in front of someone who actually knew how to use one. Then I made a line. dark blue, slightly wavering, diagonal across the lower third of the canvas. Noel looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his own brush and added something beside it, not covering my line, but responding to it. A curve that met the end of my line like a question meeting an answer. That's what painting is, he said. You say something and then someone else says something back. I thought about that for a long time afterward. By late December, we had been to dinner twice, a Thai place on Church Street in Decatur that he loved, and a barbecue spot in East Lake that I loved, and that he pretended to be skeptical about until he had his second sandwich, and went quiet in the very specific way that means a person has been won over. Completely. We had walked through Glen Lake Park on a cold afternoon and talked about our families, the ones we'd grown up in and the ones we'd made for ourselves. He had 2 older sisters and a mother in Birmingham who called every Sunday. I had a younger brother in Knoxville and a father who had taken 20 years to get comfortable with who I was but had arrived there eventually, with genuine effort. 20 years is a long time to wait, Noel said. It is, I said, but he got there. That matters to me. The open question between us, the thing neither of us had yet put into direct words, was there in every conversation like a comfortable weight. We both knew what we were building. We were just building it with care. And then came New Year's Eve. He had been invited to an event, a gallery opening and small celebration at a studio space in the Reynoldstown neighborhood. Hosted by a group of local artists, he'd become friendly with since moving to Decatur. He asked me if I wanted to come, and I said yes, and then he paused and said, "Just so you know, if you come with me, people will understand what that means. And I want to make sure that's okay with you." I looked at him, this careful, warm, paint-stained person who had somehow seen something in me before I could see it in myself, and I said, "I've been invisible long enough. I'm done with invisible." Something in his face opened like a door. The gallery space on Wiley Street in Reynoldstown was small and warm, strung with lights, and packed with people who made things for a living and talked about making things with the kind of passion that makes a room feel bigger than it is. Noel knew almost everyone, and he introduced me as Arlo without any qualifier, which was exactly right, because we both understood that the context was already there in the way he said my name. I met his friends that night, an illustrator named Constance, no wait. Her name was Marin, a book illustrator who wore overalls and had a laugh that carried across rooms. A sculptor named Teague who worked in reclaimed metals and spent 20 minutes explaining to me the structural logic of a piece he'd made from old bridge cables, which I found genuinely fascinating and told him so, which then led to the best conversation I'd had about infrastructure outside of a work meeting. There was a printmaker named Yvette who had just returned from a residency in Vermont and was full of cold weather opinions. These were Noel's people, and they were good people, and they welcomed me without ceremony or interrogation, the way people do when they've learned to take their cues from someone they trust. Just before midnight, Noel and I stepped outside. Wiley Street was quiet except for distant music from the party and the occasional car. The air had dropped to the high 30s, and our breath made small clouds between us. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said. "Thank you for asking." He looked at me with that expression, the careful one with something underneath it. But this time the something underneath was visible. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Okay." I painted that first piece, the blue and the amber, 2 weeks before you ever stopped on the sidewalk. I was painting about something I had been waiting for. I didn't know what it was yet, just the feeling of it. He paused. And then Bet told me someone had been standing outside every morning looking at it like they recognized something. And I thought that's probably exactly the right person. The words landed softly, the way the best things do. "You painted my soul before we ever spoke," I said. It came out before I had a chance to decide whether to say it, which is usually when the truest things arrive. He smiled then, not a small smile, a real one, the kind that changes the whole shape of a face. He said, "I think maybe I did." We could hear the countdown starting inside the gallery, people gathering at the windows, voices rising together through the warm, lit glass. He reached over and took my hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand finding mine in the cold air quietly, like it had always belonged there. When midnight arrived, we didn't make a big performance of it. We just stood there on Wiley Street, holding hands in the dark and the cold, and listened to the year change. January came in gray and gentle. The Kirkwood mural project started up again after the holiday delay, and on the first Saturday of the new year, Noel invited me to come along when he began the first sections of the community garden wall. The space was on a side street off Hosea L. Williams Drive, a long cinder-block wall that ran along the edge of a raised bed garden. And the neighborhood coordinator, a retired letter carrier named Augustin who had started the garden 11 years ago, walked us through his vision with the careful love of someone who had built something meaningful from scratch. Noel listened, asked questions, made notes in his sketchbook. Afterward, we sat in Augustin's kitchen and drank coffee and talked about the garden, the neighborhood, the way green things survive in the middle of hard places. Walking to the car afterward, Noel said, "I want to paint something about roots and water that Augustin could recognize. Not about him specifically, about what he built, the way things live underground before they show." "That's what you're good at," I said. "The underneath things," he looked at me. "You've been paying attention since the first painting," I said. He reached over and bumped his shoulder against mine, and I bumped back, and we walked the rest of the block like that, easy and warm against the January cold. The mural took 3 months. I went most Saturdays, sometimes just to sit nearby with my own work laptop when he was deep in concentration and didn't need conversation. Sometimes to hand him brushes or hold the paint tray. Sometimes to talk while he worked and I watched about everything and nothing, my bridge assessments, his color choices, the books we were reading, the things we were learning about ourselves. There is a quiet intimacy in being near someone who is fully absorbed in something they love. It is its own kind of gift to be trusted in that space. One Saturday in late February, he was working on the section of the mural he'd been most uncertain about, the central panel, where the roots became visible above the soil line, where what was hidden finally showed itself. He had been sketching and resketching it for weeks. He stepped back from the wall, looked at it, and went quiet. I watched him from the garden bench where I was sitting. "What's wrong?" I asked. "It's not quite right yet," he said. "The moment where the thing comes up through the ground, it looks like it's breaking through, but I want it to look like it's arriving." I thought about that. Breaking through and arriving, I thought about how different those two things felt. "Maybe it needs more space around it," I said. "Less compression at the edge." He looked at the wall, looked at me. Looked back at the wall. Then he picked up his brush and made a change, widening the space around the upward movement, giving it room to be itself. He stood back again. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's it." He turned and looked at me with something warm and wondering, and I thought, this is the thing. Not the grand gesture, not the midnight declaration. This. Two people, a cold morning, a wall, a problem solved together. This is what I had been missing. This is what I had not known I needed until I stood in front of a small painting in a coffee shop window and felt the first crack of honest light. Spring came. The mural was completed on a Saturday in April, one of those Georgia spring mornings that smells like rain and warm dirt and something beginning. Augustin had organized a small gathering, people from the neighborhood, some of the gardeners, a few of Noel's artist friends. Marin was there with her laugh. Teague came and looked at the wall for a long time without speaking, which Noel said was the highest compliment Teague gave. The mural was extraordinary. I don't have the language to do it full justice, but I'll try. It ran the full length of the cinder-block wall, maybe 60 feet. On the left end, it was all deep earth tones, browns and clay reds, the suggestion of underground systems, roots and water channels moving through layers of soil. As it moved right, things rose slowly toward a surface, colors warming toward green and amber, and finally at the far right, a full bloom of color that felt like an exhale. Like arrival. At the very center, the section he had struggled with most, there was a root system becoming visible above the ground, not breaking through but arriving, exactly as he'd said, with space around it. Unhurried, sure of itself. Augustin stood in front of it for a long time with his hand over his mouth. Then he turned around and said, "That is exactly what this garden is. That is exactly it." Noel stood beside me through all of it, the looking, the talking, the quiet admiration of neighbors who had lived on that street for years, and were now seeing something new and permanent on a wall they had walked past without much thought. At one point, he reached over and laced his fingers through mine, right there in front of everyone without any self-consciousness at all. Just his hand in mine, the same way it had been on Wiley Street on New Year's Eve, quiet and certain. Later, after one had drifted away, and Augustin had taken about 40 photographs on his phone and promised to come see Noel's studio, we walked back to the car in the late afternoon light. The kind of light that comes low and golden in April, long and warm, making everything it touches look like something worth keeping. "What comes next?" I asked, not anxious, just curious about the shape of things. "Another commission," he said. "A school in Stone Mountain wants a hallway installation, something about the history of the neighborhood." He glanced at me. "And I want to start a new series, small paintings, personal ones." "About what?" He thought about this for a moment the way he thought about things fully without rushing. "About the things you don't see at first," he said. "The infrastructure, the underneath, what holds things up without anyone noticing." I looked at him. At the paint on his fingers and his brick-colored scarf and his careful, warm, wondering eyes. "That sounds like something I'd want to look at every single day," I said again. The same words I'd said on Dekalb Avenue in November. The words that had stopped us both on the sidewalk and started the long, honest conversation we were still having. He laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded. "Then you should," he said, and I knew that he meant more than the paintings. "Here is what I know now from the other side of a year that changed everything about the shape of my life. The moments that alter us rarely announce themselves. They appear small. A coffee shop window, a handwritten card, a painting that looks like the inside of your chest. And then slowly, if you are honest enough and brave enough to follow what they're showing you, they become the whole story." I had spent years in a life that was organized and gray and careful, and I had told myself that was enough. Noel did not rescue me from that life. He didn't sweep in with some dramatic gesture and rewrite my story for me. What he did was simpler and more powerful than that. He saw something real in the world, some particular quality of color and pressure and light, and he put it honestly on a canvas, and he put that canvas in a window, and the painting did what honest things always do. It told the truth before anyone was ready to hear it. And when I was finally ready, when I had done the hard, respectful, responsible work living honestly in my own life, the painting was still there, and so was he. We had breakfast this past Sunday at a place on Sycamore Street in Decatur, a small neighborhood spot that does good eggs and strong coffee and doesn't rush you. We sat by the window. It was a plain morning. No milestones, no occasions. He had his sketchbook open beside his plate, and I had a bridge assessment report I was marking up between bites of toast. We talked about the news and about a television show we'd started watching, and about whether Augustine's fall planting would go in early this year. Outside the window, Decatur went about it Saturday morning. People walking dogs, a couple with a stroller. Two men about our age carrying coffee cups and talking about something that made them both smile. I looked at Noel across the table, at the evidence of paint on his left knuckle that never quite washed out, at the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, at the absolute dailiness of him. And I felt something that I think is the realest version of love I have ever touched. Not the pressure of two things pulling apart, not the crack before admission, something wider. Something like the center of that mural, a root arriving at the surface, unhurried, in full light, taking up the space it had always deserved. Home, I thought, this is what home feels like. And then the eggs arrived, and we ate them, and the morning continued, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, which is the only kind of morning worth having.